the best way is to approach science from the perspective of a deeply understood faith that allows us to see the beauty of science without feeling defensive in light of the results science gives us. Anything that is true has its origin in God. So we should never have to be afraid of what is true knowledge, but we have to understand it properly.
Why knowledge matters. Father, such a pleasure to have you back, and
It's
this
nice to
time
be here.
talking about your very first book, Remembering Francis, Making Sense of Modern Life.
That's right. It's my first book, I suppose, except for the stuff that I published as a scientist. But it's certainly my first real publication where I get to talk about my faith as a Franciscan friar.
Now, tell us a little bit about what made you write the book in the first place.
Well, the book has a preface and an introduction that tells you a little bit about the way I was thinking. The preface really is about what I'm trying to accomplish in the book. And as I was a scientist at the beginning of my professional life, I always thought I should write about how faith and science fits together. And I was never really satisfied with the ways that had already been explored. I know perfectly well that there's nothing in science contradicting faith and nothing in faith contradicting science. So the two can get along just fine. But in practical life, really, when you live a life, you have to kind of apply science and faith in ways where they really overlap. So it's not a theoretical problem, it's a practical problem of living well in a scientifically understood world while we have Christian faith. So that really motivated me to kind of speak of this tension between science and faith in life that so many of us know, without trying to make it go away, but to explore it constructively. So that was kind of the ambition that I had. And the question now was, how do I do this? And there's one text by St. Francis I like very much. It's his testament. It's the last text that he wrote shortly before he died. He dictated it to one of his brothers, and it's authentic. We have good evidence for the authenticity of the different manuscripts that we have. And it really is a reflection of St. Francis at the end of his life about Franciscan life. And when I looked at that, I thought, this might work. It's not about faith and science. Francis didn't care about science. It wasn't part of his world. But really the way he looked at his life, I thought I could use that. And I could kind of follow his testament and then look at different aspects as to what he wrote about. And then see how I can use that to make sense of my own life. And since I was a scientist once in my career, I thought this might be my way to go from my personal life experience and understanding of science towards talking of faith and science in a life that integrates both.
Now, chapter 1, the path to conversion. Elaborate a little bit on what you mean and how this unfolded through Francis'
Yes.
life.
So conversion is the key thing. Conversion. What does conversion mean? And it certainly doesn't mean simply starting to embrace religious practices. And so conversion is a very complicated thing. And what conversion really means is you do look at life differently. Suddenly you look at life differently, and suddenly everything is different. And suddenly nothing made sense in the way it used to make sense. And so it's a real spiritual experience of realizing that God is with us and that we can actually make sense of God's presence in our life, and that we can look at the world knowing that caring, loving God is with us, and that we are in relationship with him in life. This is really, because a conversion is a very spiritual thing, and it's not simply embracing an ideology or something like that. It's really a different appreciation of life. And Francis begins with that in his testament. He met a leper And suddenly in this encounter with the leper, something changed in his mind. And it wasn't so much a decision to now live differently, but really an understanding as to who he met, another human being calling out to him, asking for mercy, asking for care. And he realized this is kind of what life is about, what my life is about. And for myself, I mean, I go into more depth in the book chapter because I can't share the whole story, but I once went on a retreat in a monastery several years ago at a time in my life when I was quite open to looking at my life anew and making new decisions for the decades to come, and where I felt my scientific career had really reached its conclusion. I felt I had done what I could do, and I didn't feel a strong need to continue. But then in this monastery experience, in this experience of just people focusing on prayer and God, I realized I could do something very differently with my life. And that's when I realized I might also be called to live in a religious order. Not in a monastery, I'm a Franciscan friar. It's a little different for us Franciscans. But it was a conversion experience for me, a very marked moment in my life where I thought, yep, this is really what I'm supposed to be doing. So conversion is really taking the call from God seriously and not just using it as an instrument for structuring one's life and one's prayer practices, but really putting that first. And for Francis, he found that in another human being. So this is why conversion really, it always requires an encounter with other people of faith. It's not just reading a book alone. You have to live your faith with other people. Conversion can happen in marriage between husband and wife, or a parent caring for their children. Suddenly they realize it's all about things much bigger than simply my well-being for another 24 hours. So this is kind of where it starts. Conversion really means take life seriously in the sense that it's God himself who gave it to you, and live life as God's gift to you. That's conversion.
And this is also really what you describe in the second chapter, actually, where you really put forward, and to some extent it might seem very provocative for some, especially for people who might not have faith, that life only basically makes sense in relationship to God.
And I'm going much further than that by saying it's about trust and trust in the church. And today, I mean, it's not that hard to get people to say that, yes, I have trust in God. That is not great many people will say, yes, I do, when you ask them privately and in the proper context, respectful for where they're at. But to ask them, do you trust in the church, in organized religion? And then they say, okay, well, I have this neighborhood evangelical church in my area, and I know the pastor, I know the community, that makes sense to me. But then like the whole global, worldwide Catholic, Roman Catholic Church, with all its history, 2,000 years of scandal, you could say, quite legitimately, very painful for people, the abuse scandal, the suffering of innocent and by clergy, painful for those who are recovering from suffering, also for those like myself who are part of the clergy and who are part of those structures. So really having trust in the church with all this baggage, the only way you can do it is by remembering that you started with trust in God. You started with trust in God, like everybody else who's of goodwill, but you realized that Jesus Christ was God among us in human form, remains God with us in our Christian brothers and sisters, and the church provides this 2,000-year-old structure of a teaching tradition, a liturgical tradition, and the sacraments, the body and blood of Christ, the various sacraments that we have to relate ourselves bodily to Jesus Christ. All of that is what the church continues to be and to hand on. So when I say I have trust in the church, this doesn't mean at all that I have more trust in the human structures that are in the church that are as good or as fallible as in any other human institution. But there's something behind the church that a person of faith can see, that really the work of God is done by these very imperfect men and women. And we always have to struggle to work harder in really, especially as clergy, to represent Christ more genuinely, more honestly to our brothers and sisters. But the bottom line is we have to have trust in the long history of lived Christian life. And that to me is the church. And I know there are many other Christians who are more comfortable in their faith without being part of an institutional church. But if you know the history of the church as a community as a whole, the needs to teach the faith authoritatively, you need the church. And you cannot put your trust in science, because science is so much power that really putting your trust in that alone will not suffice. You have to have something else. You can learn a lot from science, a lot of just human rational knowledge, but you have to know how fallible the human person is. And the very scandals of the church tell you that you really cannot have trust in human knowledge alone. You need the divine inspiration. You need to have trust in God and to remember that in Jesus Christ, he showed himself to us. And what the church is, in as much as it is functional, is Jesus Christ at work. In as much as it is dysfunctional and harming and hurting, it's us. Very often us, the clergy, and others who are using the church for their own self-advancement. But if you remember that the clergy is in the service of Jesus Christ, and anything good that we do is the ministry of Christ, and the only thing we own is our sins and our failings, then you can have trust in the church, because you have trust in God and you have trust in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I think this really comes through the book throughout. It's really trust, but it's also hard, of course, if you had some trust in some people, as in the family, and this trust is exploited. It's very hard to actually, again, at all trust any human being. So it's certainly understandable. Now let's go a little bit further, and you mentioned science, and we will come back to this a little bit really towards the end, where you really put things into context and why faith is needed. But now first let's go and go into chapter 4 a little bit more in depth: prayer and obedience.
Prayer and obedience, that again is closely linked to the theme mentioned earlier, which is the need to put your faith into the context of a church community. So prayer is something which is handed on in traditions and lived in community. And you really have to be able to fully embrace what it means to be a human being who is not simply alone in his or her relationship to God, but who is part of the body of Christ, who has brothers and sisters, and who prays together with them, and who may be in obedience to them. And obedience then simply means to really accept that God is working through the body of his followers. And that becomes particularly hard, like in a family, you mentioned family life, and the difficulty of restoring family life after trust has been broken, when one family member abuses other family members. And there are families that overcome that and that learn to love each other beyond the abuse, that learn to forgive. And that too is a growth in faith, because this forgiveness really means we see in the person who did wrong to us that there's somebody bigger and more important hidden behind the wrongdoing. And we see more of that person by forgiving and by restoring relationships with them. So this is why in community life, in praying together and living together, in being obedient to each other, that is a way to really reach a deeper understanding as to what it means to be a human being, what it means to be the person who Jesus Christ represents for us, and the person who God made in each and every one of us. So we really learn to accept ourselves as to who we really are, which is not our individualistic libertarian freedom as my way and my way alone, but it is my way in community. And that's why prayer in community, liturgical worship in community, obedience to each other in community, they really shape us. and they shape us in a way that brings out more fully who we really are. That's the beauty of religious life. I mean, this is kind of, we get to live this with very conscious attentiveness.
In chapter 5, you're really the heart of the Testament, as
Yes.
you wrote it. You mentioned, and I think this is a key idea that might be also obviously very, very much contested, I think, especially in a secular society we live in today. And of course, we also we are informed by our friends we have, and usually they are, most of the time I would say, they are similar minded, and so that gets easily us to think that, well, still most people believe in God. But and you really provocatively, I would say, you actually say, well, the question is not if God exists, but if the human person exists.
Yes, I remember the writing that I almost forgot. That really brings it down to the point. And when I do ministry, often to young adults who haven't much upbringing in faith, like my generation still had, and going to God is just, it goes way too fast. But you can ask them, like, do you believe in yourself? Your own reality, the person who you are. And that really is a focal point. And more importantly, do you believe in the reality of a person you love? Your best friend, your partner in life, your parents, or your children, if you have them. And you realize that the human being, the human person, is a focal point of sorts, that really it is all our understanding somehow leads to this human person, that we try to understand ourselves and our neighbors. But then also, from once we grasp that, it goes outwards from there. So suddenly it's not just about individual humanity, it's about community, about social units, countries, nations, and the whole world. And that was the beauty of Francis's insight. He took this approach of reaching the center of his understanding in Jesus Christ, disclosed in this one person, leper, caring for this one person. And then he realized through this encounter with one person, he suddenly could look at the whole world in a new way. So his focal point as the human person did not mean he would stop there. Whereas anthropocentric, in the sense it's all about us. No, he went through the center and then outwards again and could embrace the whole world in all its creatures, and in today's spirituality, even the whole cosmos. So suddenly we can see the whole world as God's creation. And then we are drawn outwards from the center towards the more worldwide natural spirituality of seeing everything. But we have to go through the center. And in the secular mindset, the center has to be the human person, and then you go outwards again. But for the religiously inspired person, we see in the center Jesus Christ, and in him, the human being is fully disclosed and best understood. But through him, through the human person, we then understand the rest of the world and all its creatures. And that allows us to really live in a way that is much more attentive to all natural being than it would have been without it.
In chapter 7, you actually say that lovers of wisdom and basically the glory of God, the heavens basically proclaim the glory of God, and biology or evolution really the glory of God's life.
Yeah. So this is the second part of the book, and I'm kind of drawing on insights from philosophers of St. Francis's generation shortly thereafter. So St. Bonaventure is the man who I'm following there. He was born when Francis still lived, and he became probably the greatest theologian and philosopher of the Franciscan order in the Middle Ages. And he was skeptical of science. He was worried that too much science, he said, might actually lead you away from God. So he kind of anticipated what is now called the new atheists already in the Middle Ages. And he realized wisdom is much more important. Wisdom to really truly appreciate beauty in the world, to really appreciate how things like evolution, which is a wonderful scientific theory, draws attention how much bigger life is than our own little lives. Like we live, let's say, depend on how well we survive. We may live 60 years or 80 years. So maybe we even become 100 years old. But that is so tiny compared to life on planet Earth, which is billions of years, that you realize what we have there is God's life being outpoured in its magnificent splendor, in all its diversity, every living form that could possibly be, from the dinosaurs to bacteria. And all of that somehow is God's creation. And it's not just all just planning for us. It's not just all preparing the groundwork until finally human beings are there. All of that is the disclosure of the fullness of life in created form. So when we look at nature in this way, then suddenly science is no longer a threat to faith, but now science really becomes an inspiration for wisdom and love of God, love of beauty, and love of our neighbors.
You're also sometimes in part in the book, actually in this chapter, critical at times of believers who to some extent dismiss science.
Of course. So something as beautiful a gift as scientific insights must never be abused in some way of being of trying to have anti-scientific sentiments or trying to place faith against science. But science needs its place. So some people critique, like fundamental evangelicals who critique evolution. Their argument, if you listen to them carefully, is that they know that the human person is not simply the result of a chance encounter of certain molecules in a certain condition. They realize the human person is fundamentally different from simply an animal in the evolutionary timeline. Their opposition to certain scientific teachings really are based on philosophical disagreements, which are very legitimate, but they have to be kept out of science. So the idea is there's a need for philosophy in order to integrate science. And just as there are Christians who are misled by misinterpreting science as philosophy and critique it on this ground, there are scientists who take the science and make that as about philosophy, and who then draw conclusions from science which don't belong to science. So for me, the best way is to approach science from the perspective of a deeply understood faith that allows us to see the beauty of science without feeling defensive in light of the results science gives us. Anything that is true has its origin in God. So we should never have to be afraid of what is true knowledge, but we have to understand it properly. And just as some Christians make mistakes, and I would have made mistakes at times in my life, everybody does, we have to seek to really find a synthesis of faith and science that gives proper appreciation of both.
You also say in the book, as capitalism and also science, they are to some extent also means and mechanism, especially capitalism, to solve problems. And so, as you just said, they need to be contextualized, and we have to be aware of what they can and what they can't, and to find their proper place. Exactly. Now, science must be interpreted, and this also some might have a problem with this view, from the perspective of faith and not vice versa. Chapter 8, which is really lovers of justice.
Yes, and I think in a way for Franciscans, that might be the chapter which is most important. Because for me, faith and science is very important. Most of our Franciscan brothers are not that deeply interested in faith and science, but justice is something that really goes to the heart of the Franciscan vocation. And Francis turning to the leper in an act of care, and the rest of his life that he describes in his interactions with his brothers and the challenges he had in community life, all of that really meant to draw attention to the importance of justice, firstly in human relationships, but also justice to creatures, and to truly understand the ethical significance of how we relate to each other and how we must respect the beautiful gift that each individual human person and each creature is, and which responsibility we have before them. And a talk about another Franciscan who is not quite as well respected as Bonaventure, that's William of Ockham, well known as Ockham's razor. Not a good metaphysician. His metaphysics is not, his nominalism, I don't like it at all. But he did do good work in social justice and human rights and political theory. People don't really know that work so well by William of Ockham, but he really laid the groundwork for many important insights, such as separation of church and state. It was in the Middle Ages, not in the modern age. And he laid the groundwork for realizing that human beings have individual rights, human rights. And one of those rights is to arrange their political affairs without interference from the church, where the church ought to stay separate. It's a pretty radical thought. And he felt people have a right to their political societies, and the church has to respect that. So he was way ahead of his time, you could say, but and he got into some trouble with the church, but also with political authorities. It was mostly about politics. And but because he had all these political struggles, he really had a chance to articulate some basic concepts of human rights and human freedom that accompany us to this day. And they come out of his understanding of Christ. It is because each person who really has this power in him or herself to turn to God, to turn to Christ, to become part of the body of Christ. Because of that, we must respect this person's freedom to freely embrace the love of God. So his Christian understanding and his Franciscan understanding really meant that he could see the importance that human freedom has in order to live a fully Christian life. So he did beautiful work there, and this is really why I liked writing about him as well. And Lovers of Justice kind of, it almost concludes the book. And this is one chapter coming after that, Lovers of Christ. And I only say that as a Christian believer, I could not complete this book without really showing how in Christ and how my understanding of the life of Christ and my understanding of my own Christian faith, all these parts come together, and how I can really look at my life, my past as a scientist, my presence as a Franciscan friar, and my ministry as a priest, my writing, and all else that I do, the sacraments I celebrate. All of that makes sense by just understanding that in loving Christ, we really love life to the fullest, and we can live it in the best way possible. So this is how we make sense of life. Making sense of modern life is no different from making sense of medieval life. It really means finding a relationship with God through Jesus Christ and understanding our knowledge through that relationship in all parts of our knowledge, faith and science and social justice.
Yeah, that's very profound. It's basically putting on the glasses and looking through life, no matter what we face, through, Jesus Christ, and obviously, I think the scriptures. How did writing this book, especially the process, changed, if at all, your approach, how you see the world, especially in terms of making sense of modern life?
Well, the process of writing it was a bit of a messy process. So I'm not a very organized writer. The thing is, I start writing, and then I edit, I rewrite, I rearrange, and eventually things come together. So what kept it structured, of course, was that I had the Testament of St. Francis. So I used that to kind of pull it together. But I wrote it in kind of in spurts where I would write thousands of words each day, and then let it sit for some time, edit it, change it, let it sit for another 6 months, go back to it. So it was a long process. It took about 2 years. And in the end, I realized it wasn't long enough. The first manuscript that I submitted to my publisher, he said, it's a good manuscript, I'd like to publish it, but it's too short. It's too short for us. It needs to have at least 50,000 words, he said. And then I thought, well, how can I continue? And then I had this idea I could continue by talking of Francis's brothers and his philosophers of his generation and see what they did with his insights. So in this way, the book kind of grew. And I was doing research in parallel on faith and science and Franciscan history. And I could draw on that and bring the pieces together. And in as much as it changed my way of thinking, I think just the process of articulating my own thought really drew attention to the question that I found was most important. And what I discovered as being most important to me was no longer faith and science and the compatibility or the tension. What I found was most important was how can we make sense of natural being and really restore an understanding of rights of nature, the rights of natural beings, the natural rights of human beings, the natural rights of creatures, and our duties to the environment. And that's really the project that took on shape in my own mind as I was writing this. And that's how I want to continue to really write about how we can make sense of nature, the lives of creatures, and integrate that in the sense of our own lives.
This seems very fast. I mean, this is impressive. 2 years for a book like this. I mean, it's. I thought it took you some more time.
I suppose it did. So another way of timing the book would have been, when did I start writing it? That was novitiate. So if you take that as my starting date, it's closer to 10 years or 12 years. In novitiate, I had the idea, I wanted to write something that I could give to my nieces and nephews, because I thought they should have something that explains to them why their uncle suddenly changed course and chose a lifestyle so different from their parents. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could write something for them to explain my religious life? And back then, my nieces and nephews were, how old would they have been? They were, I think the youngest would have been 8 and the oldest 18. And no, they're all in their 20s, early 30s. And I gave them this book as a Christmas present last year. So if you look at it this way, the book took 10 years to write. And the thoughts in it certainly took 10 years to mature. But the writing itself didn't take that long. So once I had my thoughts clarified, it was just a matter of putting them into well-written sentences on paper.
Yeah, this really makes sense because it is very clearly and very nicely written. And to put something like this into writing, it really takes time. And I think it absolutely makes sense. About 10 years.
It takes editing. Mm-hmm. And it's when I work with my Franciscan brothers in our own communications, I'm often disappointed how ungrateful brothers are for the editing work that I have to do in the writing. And any good writer knows that editing is necessary. You have to edit your own work over and over and over again. And then before it goes into print, there'll be an editor of your publisher who takes another look at it. And you have to accept that. Nobody, at least nobody that of my caliber, can simply write beautiful prose from the outset. I suppose the greatest writers can do it. But more ordinary writers like myself, we need to edit our work over and over. And it means letting it sit for a few months and then editing it one more time. And it's like painting, I suppose. And I enjoy it. I like to do it in the evening when I have no hard work left to do in the day. And then just I go over my writing. I change it here and there, change one word. Sometimes I look at it again the next morning and change it back. But I'm just kind of making the small modifications, which is, it's a joyful activity. It's like being an artist. You have to love your work when you're an artist. And it's not just writing down the ideas, but making it so that I enjoy writing them and reading what I've written. That makes writing fun. It's the artistic expression. And that's not just getting the ideas out, but also making it in such a way that it's pleasant to read.
This book is really available in Franciscan Institute publications, and it was published in November 2021. So
that recently. That's right. It got delayed for another year because of COVID. And this is why, to me, it feels like an old book already. But yes, you're right. It's just been 4 months ago that it was published.
Father, it has been such a pleasure
Thank
talking
you.
about your book.
Thank you.
Remembering Francis, making sense of modern life.
Thank you very much. It was nice to talk to you again.
Father Joachim Ostermann. That's why knowledge